Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the queen of crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And oh, happy episode. We are visiting with our dear Aunt Jane. It is time to discuss a Miss Marple story. Always a happy day for me, isn't it, Catherine?
I mean, it's always a happy day for you. And I will say, friend of the podcast, outstanding Christie scholar, Jamie Bernthal, recently posted a question asking who you would actually want in your bubble as Christie characters. And this might come as a surprise to you, Kemper, but do you know who one of my first choices probably would be?
Miss Jane Marple?
It might just be her. It might just be that she would absolutely know what to do, make you some homemade liquor, be totally on top of anything going on outside. Yeah, I just feel like Miss Jane Marple might be one of the best people you could choose.
Totally agree. I mean, she covers the full spectrum of one's needs. She would take care of all of your creature comforts, and she would also protect you from murderers.
Oh, and she might perhaps, again, Dark Marple, if it came down to it, she might also murder somebody for you.
Absolutely, but it would always be for the best of reasons.
Absolutely. Our Dark Marple might be the best person you could choose.
I also think she'd be a lot less annoying than Poirot, actually.
Oh, well, also,
I think
by the
Poirot
way,
would get on my nerves.
No, but here's the biggest problem with that, Kemper, is that as we know, going into so many months of lockdown, Poirot, if you started running out of supplies, can you imagine what would happen to him if he ran out of syrops or his mustache drooped?
It would not be a good scene. It would get ugly real fast.
It would just go deeply downhill, I think.
Whereas Miss Marple would have that can-do spirit, that sort of Girl Scout ingenuity, if you will, and, make the best of a difficult situation and just soldier on through.
I mean, I would like to say, as somebody who was a Girl Scout through all of high school.
Interesting. I actually never knew that. Whole new side to you, Catherine.
I have a silver and gold award. I have the highest ranking awards in Girl Scouts. But yeah, I don't know that my can-do spirit really has helped me that much, Kemper. But Miss Marple, I feel, would be maybe Girl Guides, gives people a little bit more grit.
Sure. Well, Catherine, what are we covering today?
We're covering the tape measure murder. Perhaps an unfortunate title. So it was first published in this week in the U.S. on guess what date, Kemper?
Yes, Catherine, it was published on your birthday, November 16th. Now everyone knows.
Yes, it was published on November 16th, 1941, and it was subsequently on a less great date, obviously, published in February of 1942 in The Strand under a different title, The Case of the Retired Jeweler. It was collected in Three Blind Mice and Other Stories in the U.S. in 1950 by Dodd Mead, and in Miss Marple's Final Cases posthumously in the UK by Collins Crime in October of 1979.
Quite late there to be published in a book collection in the UK.
No, we get a few of these once in a while, right? Where it's oh, that's kind of odd that this was not actually published in a collection.
No, absolutely. And obviously that Three Blind Mice collection was not one that was published in the UK, since Three Blind Mice still has never been published in the UK.
Right.
So I just feel bad for the British populace that they were deprived of this shining Miss Marple short story in book form for so long. But fortunately, we are all on the same page, so to speak. So let's just get right into it and talk about our victim, one Mrs. Spenlow, who is a relatively wealthy woman in the present day, and she has been strangled in her living room, and she happens to live in, that's right, St. Mary Mead.
I know.
Funny story, and this relates obliquely to Agatha Christie, but as I was reading the story, I realized that I kept on supplying in my head the name Dora for Mrs. Spenlow. And then I had to look back and I was like, wait, is she called Dora Spenlow? Like, why am I doing that? And I realized that I was giving her the first name of Dora because that's the character name in David Copperfield, his first wife, Dora Spenlow.
Right.
Poor sweet Dora. She, spoiler alert, did not make it to the end of David Copperfield.
Spoiler alert, Mrs. Spenlow does not make it through the beginning of the story.
But, we know that Christie loved her Dickens, so maybe she was inspired by
I imagine so.
Dora Spenlow. I mean, this will relate a little bit, and, this is a short story episode, so we can be a little fast and loose with the spoilers here. But what they say she is strangled with at the beginning of the story, the police's best guess is that it was possibly a very narrow belt. I'll be honest with you, even after reading that and knowing what the title of the story was, I didn't make the connection as I was reading. That's how much of a lazy, passive reader I was being as I read this story, because I was just so excited to be back in St. Mary Mead with Miss Marple. So, yeah, I was still,
Well, if you want to talk about like a Marpellian thing that I have been trying to do for like the last 2 weeks is that I've been desperately trying to figure out how to do English paper piecing, which is a kind of hand-sewn quilting technique. And so I have like on my floor in my living room at least 3 tape measures. I'm not kidding.
See, if Miss Marple were in your quarantine bubble, you would be much further ahead on that technique, I'm sure.
Well, she'd also teach me knitting, which I am like incapable of doing. So that would be that would have been great. To have been able to knit at some point would have been great, but I unfortunately completely lack that skill. And I'll be honest, Kemper, I'm not entirely sure that I have the skill of English paper piecing either.
Well, what you do have skill at is in breaking down puzzle mysteries, be they long or short. So
Correct.
Let's continue, and you can tell us a little bit about our suspects, or should I say suspect?
Yeah, there's pretty much only one. There's sort of two-ish. We get Mr. Spenlow, obviously, because, of course, the husband. Of course.
Gotta look at the husband, yeah.
Right, and he's this sort of small, quiet, clean, boring retiree who, unfortunately for him, seems very unconcerned with his wife's murder.
He just doesn't emote very much.
At all.
He's a very reserved man.
Reserved would be putting it lightly, I think. He seems like, oh yeah, that's a thing that happened. And we also have Ted Gerard, who is a much younger kind of rake who has this embezzlement scandal under his belt. And he's recently been to St. Mary Mead.
Right, because he's recently undergone a conversion, right? He seems to have undergone some sort of a religious conversion, which may or may not be important later on. We shall see.
All right, so the world as it appears to be, Kemper.
Well, we open in St. Mary Mead with the village seamstress / dressmaker, Miss Pollitt, who we're told is a former lady's maid. She has that kind of lean, spare sort of look to her. I was immediately able to visualize her. I knew exactly what Christie was going for. She's standing outside of Laburnum Cottage, which is the home of the Spenlows, and she has a dress of Mrs. Spenlow's that needs to be tailored in hand, and she's knocking on the door because she had an appointment for dress alterations. Nobody answers despite her multiple knocks, and then there's a figure coming down the street. That would be Miss Hartnell, who we've seen before in stories from St. Mary Mead. This is one of the other spinsters, not to put too fine a point on it, within Miss Marple's circle in St. Mary Mead. She's described as jolly, weather-beaten, 55, and having a loud bass voice, which is definitely her most recognizable characteristic. And she says, "Good afternoon," or I should say, "Good afternoon, Miss Pollitt." And the dressmaker basically tells her about her conundrum here, which is that she can't seem to get into the house for this appointment. And Miss Hartnell basically just takes this opportunity to snoop and runs with it. And she starts tapping at windows because she knows that Mrs. Spenlow couldn't have left the house because she would have run into her. Mr. Spenlow left it some time ago, apparently to see Miss Marple, or at least that's what he thinks is going on. We'll get to that in a moment when everyone starts accounting for their whereabouts. And this is actually, I mean, I did find this to be, as is so often the case in Miss Marple short stories, a quite well and breezily written story by Christie.
Right.
It goes down super easy. And I really appreciated the scene where Miss Hartnell finds Mrs. Spenlow dead, because she's like literally looking through the window. And she says, I'll just take a look through the windows and see if I can find any signs of life. And then she laughs in her usual hearty manner, and she gives a perfunctory glance through the front window. And Christie writes, perfunctory as it was, though, it succeeded in its object. Miss Hartnell, it is true, saw no signs of life. On the contrary, she saw, through the window, Mrs. Spenlow lying on the hearthrug, dead.
Right. And anybody who ever says that Agatha Christie is not funny, think about how cleverly worded and funny that sentence is.
Yeah.
2 sentences.
Yeah.
So they get Constable Polk of St. Mary Mead. And, you know, subsequently we're going to get both Colonel Melchett and Inspector Slack, who we are very familiar with, both of them. They come in a little bit later, but Constable Polk comes. And, you know, it's 'tis murder, obviously. And the husband, as Occam's razor goes, is the most likely murderer, right? Because who else would it have been? The house was closed and nobody was seen going in or out, and it was a limited time window. So clearly it was pretty much him.
We're also told that Mrs. Spenlow is actually the one who had the money between the two of them, and that upon her death, her husband inherits all of that. So we've got a fairly ironclad motive for the husband murdering his wife as well.
We get a stray detail that after going through the scene, Constable Polk seems to have picked up an odd pin that ends up in his like jacket lapel.
His tunic.
Yeah. So
yeah, and it's Miss Marple who notices it, so chances are it's important.
Yeah, and again, short story. Chances are this is probably the most important clue, right?
Yeah, but you know, nothing's really remarked about it. He's just sort of like, oh yeah, look at that. Mr. Spenlow says that Miss Marple rang him up, that she actually called him at the cottage and asked him to come over, that she was anxious to consult him about something.
Right. And there's like a very small window, right?
Right. That's the primary reason, I suppose, why they're talking to Miss Marple, is to ascertain whether or not she actually did call Mr. Spenlow. And she says, certainly not. You know, she never rang him up at 2:30 or any other time. So, you know, you can tell that they're thinking, okay, well, he's just lying about that. He's pretending that the phone rang, but it never did.
Right. And like, you know, maybe he never left the house at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although, except he did at 3:15 show up at Miss Marple's house, because her maid can attest to that, because her maid told him that, in fact, Miss Marple was at the Women's Institute, which she was. So she could not have called, but he was seen there. It's just that the time frame is enough that he also clearly could have murdered his wife.
He easily could have murdered her, left out the back, walked over to Miss Marple's, had the conversation with the maid, and then come back and been agog at the fact that his wife had been murdered.
We also find out in all of this that Mrs. Spenlow was at one point also a maid in house of one Sir Robert Abercrombie. And then this is actually her second marriage. She married a gardener. They were divorced. She became a very successful florist. And then she married Mr. Spenlow, who had been a very successful jeweler. And then they both retired, and then they both moved to St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Spenlow was, you know, deeply involved with the Church of England, and they were social. And here's the other really critical fact here. Miss Marple likes Mr. Spenlow.
Yes, and she likes him a lot.
Mm-hmm, and one of the most important things that we should always acknowledge in Miss Marple is that her judgment is to be trusted.
Yeah, I mean, that goes for Poirot. It goes for Miss Marple, too. And how many people does Miss Marple genuinely like?
Very few.
Very, very few. Especially, how many married men does Miss Marple like? Let's put it that way. Not many. So I think we can sort of take her at face value here, that it can't be Mr. Spenlow. It would also be a pretty boring short story, wouldn't it, if it were Mr. Spenlow? The chronology of Mrs. Spenlow's past, you know, it's interesting. And Christie really very casually lays it in there that she left her position as a between maid to marry the second gardener. And with the second gardener, they started a flower shop in London. And then the shop did really well.
Right.
The gardener, not so much. He died. And then she went on to marry Mr. Spenlow. I actually had to look this up because I did not know what a between maid was. And I didn't even really remark on the term until Miss Marple made reference to her position later on in the story. And she called her a tweenie, which I thought was really funny. I was like, oh, I've never heard a maid called a tweenie before. And my guess was that a between maid was halfway between, a more downstairs sort of scullery-ish maid and an upstairs ladies' maid somehow. But I was totally wrong about that. A between maid is a maid who works very much in the downstairs area, never goes upstairs. And she works between the butler, the housekeeper, and potentially even the cook, essentially serving those upper servants. Mm-hmm. So she's very much the maid who would be serving in the servants' hall at dinner, a little bit like Daisy from Downton Abbey.
Sure.
Daisy was very much a scullery maid. I think she was pretty much confined to the kitchen for the many, many years that series ran.
Right.
But the between maid would serve those upper servants, but very much be a downstairs servant. So that is someone who's coming from very, very modest beginnings as a between maid to then open up a flower shop once she's coming out of service and then have the flower shop do well and then become this fairly well-to-do wife of a retired jeweler and, living with her own house in St. Mary Mead. So Mrs. Spenlow has done extremely well for herself.
Right, and seems also to be relatively well-liked in St. Mary Mead. And as we know about St. Mary Mead, it's a real judgy town.
Yeah.
The thing about it is Miss Marple, as again we said, she very staunchly stands her ground basically on the innocence of Mr. Spenlow. She makes a funny comment. There's a sort of aside that, well, perhaps there was an argument between the Spenlows about money, but Miss Marple just absolutely throws it away in like one line, and she says, they're not quarreling.
That was one of my other favorite moments in the story because it's also legitimately so funny.
It's really funny.
This is what Christie writes. She's speaking with Inspector Slack, of course. Mm-hmm. It's another Miss Marple Inspector Slack duel that's happening here. He, of course, wants to go for the easy way out, as per usual. He says, what with the money angle and if they'd been on bad terms lately? But Miss Marple interrupted him. Oh, but they hadn't. You know that for a fact. Everyone would have known if they'd quarreled. The maid, Gladys Brent, she'd have soon spread it round the village. The inspector said feebly, she mightn't have known, and received a pitying smile in reply. She doesn't even have to say anything. She's like, that's Miss Marple's version of like, oh, sweetie, no.
Yeah. No, you don't understand. Everybody would have known.
The maid would have talked. She's like, oh, sweetie, you're so cute. But no, she just shuts him down.
Right. And so she slightly nods towards Ted Gerard. She notes that Mrs. Spenlow had kind of the crush on him.
They were spending a lot of time together, right?
Right. And so she says that, but also in the same thing she says, and she notes, because of course Miss Marple knows this, even though she's not the police, is that Mrs. Spenlow was found wearing a kimono. So suggestive, right?
Right. Suggestive of the fact that perhaps Mrs. Spenlow and Ted Gerard were having an affair. It's interesting, too, because this is, for a short story, there were a lot of things that I had to look up, get the full context. But, it's mentioned that he's part of the Oxford Group, which was this, Christian organization that was very much about redeeming oneself. It was all about kind of redemption and forgiveness and becoming a better person. And, apparently they believe that the solution to life was to surrender oneself over to God's plan and to, just be a better person and make amends, et cetera, et cetera. This has American origins, not surprisingly, the Oxford Group, because, Americans take things to either extreme. It's just kind of a fact. So we're either really good or really bad. And they come around to the same place anyway. So that's interesting and not really in any way resolved before we get to our clues that bridge us over into the world as it actually is. So perhaps that's going to be important.
It might be. episode is brought to you by Yarn.
Yarn, you say?
You heard me, Kemper. Yarn. As in a tale one spins?
Well, that actually makes a lot of sense because Yarn is an interactive storytelling app where stories are told as text messages between the main characters. Genres range from romance to comedy, horror to action, and more. It also offers video and audio-only episodes to watch and listen to on your phone in a few minutes. Basically, it's like taking the 19th century novel and dragging it into the 21st century with all the attendant bells and whistles the internet has to offer. My kind of app.
So much joy to be had in perusing all of the content, and we're sure you, our dear listeners, will agree.
So tap through the most addictive and immersive stories today only on Yarn. Trust me, with over 27 million downloads, Yarn is a must-play. Download Yarn for free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's YARN. Download it today to watch, read, and listen to all your favorite fiction stories. From steamy to horror, Yarn has it all.
We really only have a few clues here. We have the first clue, which we already mentioned, which is that pin. Because, the constable comes to the scene, and then also he randomly ends up with, and it's a straight pin.
Here's the thing. It's a little bit of a cheat because we're not given a specific description of the pin until Miss Marple is explaining everything to Colonel Melchett at the end. This is what she says. Because he says, "What's a pin? It was only a common pin, sort of thing any woman might use." And she replies, "Oh no, Colonel Melchett, that's where you're wrong. To a man's eye, perhaps it looked like an ordinary pin, but it wasn't. It was a special pin, a very thin pin, the kind you buy by the box, the kind used mostly by dressmakers."
Yeah. Yeah.
But we're not told that. We're just told that there's a pin in his tunic.
Right. Although, given the title of the story, given who the first person on the scene is, and given that anybody who's ever sewn would know what you use pins for, you can kind of make that leap really quickly.
Sorry, Catherine, we're not all quilting in our spare time at the moment.
Well,
okay? So
again,
we might not all be in the, you're just in the zone here.
I know. Although, just to be clear, Kemper, quilting, let's put that in quotation marks so that nobody has any expectation of me.
You're going to have to put something up on the Gram account. Let us see your progress.
Somebody listening to this could give me some advice about cutting out the shapes better, because I have had to toss some. So
I'll bet you that someone listening to this could actually give you some really good advice. I wouldn't be surprised.
I would not remotely be surprised. So
help Catherine out.
I know. Help me with my hand stitching. So clue number 2, Kemper.
Clue number 2. Okay. So we also do know that there had been a jewel theft at the Abercrombie's residence. That is the family that Mrs. Spenlow was working for as a tweenie. And that suddenly she then came into money because she was able to start up this florist shop with the second gardener after they got married. So it seems that they somehow, acquired a lump sum that is not easy to come by as a lowly between maid. It also seems that if she in fact did have anything to do with it, she likely wasn't acting alone. That sort of throws suspicion on her husband, of course. And to be fair, we have to make some leaps here, but they're modest leaps, because is there anyone else who's been mentioned in the story who perhaps was also a servant before she was in her present career?
Do I get the third clue, Kemper, as always?
I have orchestrated this so that Catherine once again can get the third clue, because this dovetails nicely with the second clue. Please take it away, Catherine.
Never, ever, ever underestimate the help. Never do it. Because who is the other member of the servant class originally, who's now sort of moved up a little bit the ladder, who figures so prominently in this story?
mentioned on the very first page, oh, so casually. Oh, Agatha, you master, you wily mystery writer. Let's bring it home, Catherine. Resolution here.
Yeah, let's go for it. So let's just say up front that whole story that Miss Marple sort of tells about, Ted Gerard had this whole crush, the kimono thing, blah, blah, blah. It was basically a feint, right? Because Miss Marple at no point clearly thinks that. So she decides to do what she does, which is put a plan in action. And she rolls up a dress to bring to Miss Pollitt. And then what, Kemper?
So she goes into the post office and she kind of just gets a sense of the daily routine there, the daily rhythms, comings and goings of people. Because the one thing that has to be accounted for here, if Mr. Spenlow didn't do it, is that he wasn't lying about that phone call that he got from, quote unquote, Miss Marple that was drawing him away from the house. So who made that phone call? How and when did that happen? Well, we know when it happened, but we don't know how that happened. And what she realizes is that there's a period of time right around 2:30 when there's a bus that actually comes in from the outside world into St. Mary Mead, into the bubble of St. Mary Mead. And it's a big event. And the postmistress goes out and there's just a lot of hubbub and distraction going on. And it would be very easy for a person to slip into the public telephone box in the post office at that time, make a quick, discreet call, perhaps pretending to be one Miss Jane Marple. How dare this person?
I know. Sacrilege.
Cast aspersions on our Miss Marple. And then go about her business. And you know what? It would be a lot easier if said person lived close to that public telephone box. And where does Miss Pollitt live, Catherine?
Basically above the post office.
Yeah, she lives right above it. So she actually does even go through with this ruse. And Christie writes, not till the postmistress returned to her post after the bus came did Miss Marple go upstairs and explain to Miss Pollitt that she wanted her old gray crepe altered and made more fashionable if that were possible. Miss Pollitt promised to see what she could do. And then she goes straight to Colonel Melchett. She goes over Inspector Slack's head, by the way.
I know. I noticed that too, which I think is really funny.
Yeah, she totally pulls rank on Inspector Slack.
Yeah, it's a very Miss Marple thing to do because, why bother even?
Indeed.
Yeah, and she basically, just explains what happened because the answer here is incredibly obvious.
It's a good little puzzle because it is one of those puzzles where once she explains everything, you're like, oh my God, this is so simple and obvious. But I certainly didn't make every single connection. I mean, the pin is very obvious when we get up to the other side of it. The narrow belt is, of course, a tape measure.
Hence the title of the entire story. Yes. Yeah,
the title is perhaps a little bit of a spoiler, but I really do love that when a title is also a major clue and it doesn't spoil things, which it really didn't for me. That's just that it's that extra added bit of cleverness and audacity on Christie's part. So the pin is very obvious when we're on the other side of it. The title is super obvious. The kimono, which also confounded me a little bit because I did think it was a little weird that Mrs. Spenlow was in a kimono. That's super obvious because she was about to have a dress fitting.
Right.
I mean, the idea is that Miss Pollitt came in, Mrs. Spenlow let her in, and the murder happened in her living room. And she was, of course, dressed in her kimono because she was about to put the dress on that Miss Pollitt was holding. They never got that far because then Miss Pollitt strangled her with her tape measure and then left the house quickly and then knocked on it again. And we've seen those sorts of time shifts and temporal obfuscations in Christie many, many a time before. But of course, we need to also figure out why Miss Pollitt murdered Mrs. Spenlow. So what's the reason behind all of this, Catherine?
Again, we mentioned that Mrs. Spenlow has now become a very respectable member of St. Mary Mead. And she then also gets a little bit swayed by this fellow Ted Gerard. He convinces her to quote unquote come clean, basically just to clear her conscience about any sort of guilt of past affair, anything in her past, so she could, I guess, become holier.
She's making amends. She's on the making amends portion, I feel like, of her 12-step program where like you kind of have to, you know, just come clean.
Right. So the thing is, Miss Pollitt, unfortunately, also finds this out. And they were, unfortunately, the people who robbed their old employers.
That's how Mrs. Spenlow had the money to open up her florist shop with her first husband. And I mean, and Miss Marple sums it up in her usual brutal yet accurate way. Well, I mean, accurate, hence brutal way, where she says they both got the same amount of money, obviously, out of the robbery, but it all worked out for one, and it didn't really amount to much for the other. For Mrs. Spenlow, everything she did turned out well. Money made money, but the other one, the lady's maid, must have been unlucky. She came down to being just a village dressmaker. Then they met again, and then it was quite all right at first, because obviously that was a secret that they both wanted to keep. But when, you know, Ted Gerard came on the scene and Mrs. Spenlow started feeling like she needed to unburden herself, that obviously is going to affect Miss Pollitt, because she's just going to tell what they did. And, you know, it's not really stated, but I would imagine that maybe she even told Miss Pollitt what she was going to do. And that's why Miss Pollitt said, well, in that case, I need to murder you. So it's a very convincing reason. I mean, it's a great motivation for murder.
Yeah, of course it is. It's also just very clean. Everything about this story is actually very clean. It all makes very clear sense. I really like that she didn't even really have to leave. All she had to do was murder her, walk out the door, and then just stand outside knocking.
And that's believable, too, because it's a village where there aren't that many people passing by all the time. We're not in London. There aren't, you know, a ton of people that are going to see. She could pick her time carefully that way anyway. Yeah, I mean, and all the characters make sense, too. I mean, it's clean both as to puzzle and character. They're all eminently believable, every single one of them.
It's a very neat little story. If you forgive the title, which, I mean, I do have to say is rather unfortunate.
I suppose, but again, I mean, it didn't spoil it for me. And that American title is, I don't know, not quite as evocative.
The British, that was the British title is the one.
Oh, no, excuse me. The British title for me was not quite as evocative. The Case of the Retired Jeweler. I mean, I suppose it does put the suspicion squarely on Mr. Spenlow right from the get-go. That's not bad.
I mean, it's not evocative, but it also is a misdirect, and it kind of complicates it a little bit more than calling it the tape measure murder.
That's true. Fair point.
This episode is brought to you by Best Fiends.
So normally when we talk about Best Fiends, we check in with Catherine about Howie, get a little relationship status update.
Important.
But, yes, it is. But this time I'd like to do something a little different. We've been hearing from a number of you, our dear listeners, about your own experiences with Best Fiends, and I had to share one of them because I think we can all be inspired by the heights this particular person has achieved. Now, I'm quoting here from an actual email that was sent to us recently. Are you ready, Catherine?
I'm a little scared, but I'm ready.
All right. I'm on level 1026, and things have changed. There are 3 paths to games, fewer fiends popping out of boxes, and it gets harder and harder to solve a puzzle on the first try. That is the end of the quote from this tantalizing email. Level 1026, Catherine. And yet, our listener continues on, one more happy little soldier in the ever-expanding universe of Best Fiends.
I'm shook, Kemper, and I mean that in the best of ways.
I don't blame you. So, engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must-play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. You know, this is another one, and we say this so often when we cover these Miss Marple short stories that haven't been adapted in the English language. It's such a shame that it didn't get adapted, because this is another one that takes place in St. Mary Mead. We're in situ, right, with Miss Marple. This isn't one of those awkward framed stories, the stories in a story, you know, that we have in 12 out of the 13 short stories and the 13 problems. I'm honestly not sure why the ITV Marple series did not adapt this one. I mean, they did adapt Greenshaw's Folly with a little sprinkling of the thumb mark of St. Peter, and I'm glad that they did that one, but this one would have made a fantastic 90-minute adaptation. You easily could have filled it out, and I think just had a great little Miss Marple story set right in St. Mary Mead.
I know. I quite like this story, Kemper, and I think it's really worth reading. It's very short, so not going to take a lot of your time. So anybody who is really busy at this point, doom scrolling on Twitter, can certainly read this. I think what we probably could all use now is the clarity and clean lines of this story.
Agreed. And for true tape measure murder heads, there actually is an adaptation of this. It is a Japanese language adaptation. It's part of the 2004-2005 Agatha Christie's Great Detectives Poirot and Marple series, which we did cover. We covered an episode of that series on our Patreon account
we
were taking a closer look at some non-English language adaptations of Christie out there in the world, which is one of the big holes that we have in this podcast generally. You know, we don't cover non-English language adaptations, and there are a lot, and especially in Japan, actually, within the last 20 or so years, there's been a lot of activity, and it's a great series. You know, it features this crossover character named Mabel and her pet duck Oliver, because it's anime. Yep, this is an anime series,
it's delightful.
It's actually really charming.
No, and I know actually some people, even in the last few weeks, have asked us about this on Twitter if we had ever intended to cover this. We did cover it. It's just on the Patreon account.
Yeah, it's just on the Patreon, but highly recommend. I think that the series is a bit hard to get one's hands on.
It is, except
outside of Japan.
So delightful. I'm going to just be totally honest. It is delightful, and so if you can find it, please do.
And they cover a lot of these Miss Marple short stories that have not been covered elsewhere. I believe that The Case of the Perfect Maid is on there. Motive versus Opportunity. Ingots of Gold, I remember, was also on there. But also a lot of Christie classics as well. And the length of the adaptations varies quite a bit. So for the, shorter Christie stories, they might just be 1 or 2 episodes. And then for the longer novels, 3 or 4 episodes.
Right.
And just really, really well done, with a lot of care, but also, a lot of cultural specificity when it comes to anime, which I was there for it. I just found everything about it to be charming. The love that they had for Christie. They're
very faithful adaptations. I mean, outside of the talking duck.
Even though they feature a duck, they're actually very faithful. It's true.
Yeah. And also, I can't reiterate this enough times, even though we reiterated it over and over and over again on the Patreon episode. It really does have the greatest opening and closing theme songs of any show that has ever existed.
Should almost just watch it for the opening credits alone. It's just pure gold.
It's 100% worth seeking them out. I mean, not just to be delighted over their credits, but because I think they're nicely done adaptations.
And we do clip from the opening credits sequence, even though, of course, you're only getting the audio of it. It's better than nothing if you would like to check that out on our Patreon account, which is over at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. And I think that's probably a good segue into...
look at you. Smooth sailing, Kemper.
Our end notes here, the part of the episode where most people probably press stop, but that's okay. We will persevere because some of this is, new information to those who have perhaps just joined us or want to find out what we are covering next. And what are we covering next, Catherine? Because it's pretty exciting.
The Pale Horse, Kemper.
The Pale Horse. I am so excited to be covering this late career Christie gem, dare I say.
I mean, I think we might have some witches in store.
We've got some witches. We've got Ariadne Oliver. We have some other crossover characters, actually. This is one that actually is very squarely placed in the Christie-verse, and we see some people pop up who we haven't seen for decades, actually. So it's all very exciting. So we can't wait to cover that one in our next episode. And in the meantime, we would love to hear from you, of course. You can visit us over on our Patreon site, as I just mentioned. You could also email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @allaboutthedame, and Catherine's Twitter handle is @brobcat. Perhaps you might want to tweet some quilting suggestions to her.
I'll do a poor job at them, but I will try.
You can also find us on Facebook. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and our Instagram handle is @allaboutagatha, where Catherine will be showcasing her quilting prowess in the months to come. I'm sure that's a guarantee now, Catherine. You basically have to do it.
I mean, I kind of appreciate being forced now because it does place a level of burden on me. So I don't know if I should hate you or thank you for it.
I'm trying to motivate you here. It's a constructive carrot I'm dangling here.
It's always appreciated, Kemper.
If you haven't yet rated or reviewed us, we would really appreciate it if you did, especially since it helps other people find the podcast. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's Knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.